Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. Looking forward to talking to you about some of the work I've done with bumblebees and fire in the past. It's not a topic that I'm presently working on in my current position, so it's always exciting to get to go back and talk about this work a little bit more. So hopefully you learned something, and at the very least, hopefully you have a good 20 minutes or so. So yeah, we're going to talk about how bumblebees in California, or at least one species of bumblebee in California, and their floral food resources responded to an unexpected wildfire. And I don't want to make any assumptions about folks' knowledge about bumblebees before getting into the talk. So I was going to briefly address bumblebees in general and some conservation issues around them. But maybe bumblebees are familiar, fuzzy, and adorable creatures. There's over 250 species of bumblebees worldwide. Typically, species diversity is highest in temperate regions, hence the fuzzy coats. And of course, as you're likely aware, there are a variety of conservation concerns around bumblebees, specific species, various populations. And there's a lot of nuance to this that I'm not going to get into in my talk, but happy to field questions and discuss some of that nuance later. I will briefly say, though, that as has been mentioned, a lot of the conservation energy for bumblebees right now is centered around the rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis. And up until 3 or 4 weeks ago, this was the first and only species listed, bumblebee species listed under the Endangered Species Act. So I see a lot of the work around rusty patch bumblebee within the ESA framework as being sort of our first chance to get things right or get them wrong. So the research that goes into rusty patch bumblebee and how we manage the first bumblebee under the Endangered Species Act really is going to set the precedent going forward. Briefly, some of the other species that you may want to be aware of in the bumblebee world include these 4 listed here: Crotchii, Franklini, Occidentalis, and Sucklei. I'm not going to get into details of these right now either, but wanted to put them on your radar, especially if you're in the West. And the reason this slide contains crossed out text is because seemingly every time I reuse this slide, something has changed in the legal proceeding of these species. I will say, though, that Franklini has been listed, which is a happy, sad moment, right? Sad to need listing, happy to have received listing. So we're all on the same page about some generalities in the bumblebee life cycle. I'm going to walk you through a brief schematic of that life cycle. So bumblebees have a somewhat similar life cycle, I like to say, to an annual plant, more so than something like a honeybee. And what I mean by that is that queens emerge early in the spring here. And hopefully you can see my cursor. If not, center top. Queens emerge early in the spring as solitary individuals. They collect pollen and nectar and establish their nests. They don't have a worker caste with them. Instead, they produce their own workers throughout the spring and summer until the colony grows to a size where it can produce new queens and males, rather, late in the summer or early in the fall. At that point, hopefully queens and males from different colonies mate, and then everybody except the new queens dies and does not overwinter, and the new queens, hopefully mated, overwinter on their own. And so the key takeaway here is that we have an organism that starts out solitary, moves into being social, and then goes back to solitary. And another key point is that the bumblebee flight season is rather long. And I think this is important to consider because if we were to think about a plant community such as this, where each of these blobs of color and curves represents, let's say, the flowering period of an individual plant species, bumblebees are out foraging on landscapes across the flowering period of many species, whereas small solitary species, which are obviously important in their own right, but they might overlap only with a few plant species out on the landscape. So if you subscribe to the idea of umbrella species, or even if you don't, you might at least think of bumblebees as being good target organisms for sort of capturing the floral needs of lots of other pollinating and flower visiting species. So that's my little crash course on bumblebees, but now we're going to get into the specific topic for today of how bumblebees might respond to fire, or at least did in this one particular instance. So of course, as we are gathered here today to discuss, wildfire can be massively economically impactful, ecologically impactful. It can have large effects on plants, animals, water regimes, nutrient flow, all sorts of effects after fire. And oftentimes these landscapes that have burned can look briefly very barren. This is from a grassland at one of my study sites in the Coast Range of California. But it's not uncommon in these systems to see a big rush back of resources briefly after fire. And a lot has been learned about changes in plant diversity, morphology, resource availability from studying plants before and after fire. But I also like to consider these as opportunities to investigate these obligate visitors of these plants, our fuzzy pollinating friends. And it also gives us the rare chance to examine resource limitation in these organisms, which can often be difficult if we had to, say, put out a bunch of flowers. It's hard to put out as many flowers suddenly as a fire can in some instances. So of course, there's a variety of ways that fire can change landscapes for pollinators. First of all, we can have these abundant and diverse flowers following fire. We can also have changes in the availability of nesting habitat. So for something like a ground nesting species, fire may open up lots of opportunities for new nesting substrate. But for something like a twig nesting species, like Molly alluded to, it may be quite a bad scenario and eliminate a lot of the potential twigs. There can also be changes in the quality of resources. And so this kind of harkens back to what Scott mentioned in his introduction about habitat degradation and habitat quality. So it's not just, do we have more or less habitat, but what is sort of the food or resource concentration in those habitats? And fire can alter that as well. A lot of the work on pollinator or bee responses to fire to date focuses on space for time substitutions. So this is where we look at a bunch of different sites that vary in the time since they last burned. These studies are massively useful and generally find that there are changes in bee abundance and diversity, so that abundance or diversity is highest in more recently burned sites and then declines over time. And meta-analysis of these studies backs this up. Generally, there's positive effects of fire on bee abundance. And while these studies are very useful, they still leave a lot to be desired. So there's big differences between sites potentially, other than just the time since they last burned. But it also sort of smooths out some of the details that we might want to know about how individual species or species of particular interest respond to fire. So we might want to know things like how population size changes. So it could be that an abundance of resources following fire concentrates foragers into a small area rather than actually increasing the population size of bees within an area. We may want to know how individual landscapes look before and after fire. We may want to know things about intraspecific variability, since that can increase robustness to other disturbances. Something like changes in body size. If we have increased body size, we often see increased survival or reproductive output. And we might want to know things about demographic effects as well. When I began this research, though, I wasn't thinking about fire explicitly. I've worked on fire and flammability of fuels in the past, but at the beginning of my dissertation, in addition to having questionable facial hair, I mostly was thinking about things like foraging range and dispersal distance, these sort of tricky things to learn about bumblebees. So I went out to the McLaughlin Reserve, which is in the Coast Range of California. It's a gorgeous mix of grasslands, oak woodland, and chaparral. And I began collecting genetic samples of Bombuspots nasenskyii. Now, a big limitation to this study is that in this landscape, Bombuspots nasenskyii, or the yellow-faced bumblebee, makes more than 95% of the bumblebees that you observe there. So, you know, in landscapes where bumblebee richness is much higher, these results that you're about to see might be a little different depending on how common or uncommon a species may be. So in 2015, I began collecting genetic samples at 5 places in the reserve. Don't quite know how to refer to it because each of these dots is a subset of sites, really. But as is common in California, 2 fires then burned through the study area in July and August of 2015 after my sampling was complete, thus splitting the sites in half. So there's some old mining equipment here, so they established a fire break here. So fortuitously, that split the sites in half. We have before and after in burned and unburned sites. So a fairly unique opportunity, though it sounds like it's becoming less and less unique in California every year. And what we found in our initial surveys in these sites following fire is congruent with what others have found and what we might expect for this landscape, which is that the burned sites had higher floral abundance than the unburned sites. But a particular nuance to this that's sort of interesting is that this higher floral abundance comes not because of just wholesale floral abundance, but because the burned sites bloom for longer. So early in the season, in the early spring, burned and unburned sites have about the same amount of floral resources, but the burned sites bloom for a few more weeks than the unburned sites. And this is mostly because invasive grasses have been knocked back, so the forbs that bumblebees are foraging on had a little bit more of a head start and could fend off those grasses just a little bit longer. It's worth pointing out that there were no large changes in plant species identity that explained this difference in floral abundance, at least as far as the species that I was recording were concerned. And I was only recording species that bumblebees were using for this particular study. So basically, while there's a change in the overall floral abundance, bumblebees are foraging on the same things before and after fire in this system. There's just more of those plants available to them. And these are some of the 4 most common plants that they forage on, including a non-native vetch, which makes for an interesting conservation conundrum. For our visual learners out there, I include this image that basically summarizes all those results, saying before fire, we had these nice grasslands with some forbs poking up. And then after fire, we had these dense carpets of resources that bumblebees love. An important thing to point out in this initial survey is that also bumblebees were present in the landscape the first year after fire. So at the sites where we had more floral, higher floral abundance, we also captured more bumblebees. And the sites with higher floral abundance tended to be the sites that had burned. And so this is an important first caveat before moving on, that bumblebees actually are present in the landscape. So from this initial study, we learned a few things that are, I think, if you're familiar with the literature or familiar with these landscapes, are somewhat unsurprising, maybe with the exception of knowing that they bloomed for longer. These are kind of what we would expect. But we can expand upon what we learned by digging into some of that genetic data that we have before and after fire. And specifically, we might want to consider how we measure bumblebee population sizes. So we know from counting workers that we have more workers present in the burned sites than the unburned sites. But worker abundance isn't really a great measurement of bumblebee population size. Instead, we would want to consider things like colony abundance or queen abundance, since those are basically the reproductive units of bumblebees. And it could just be that we're aggregating workers from a few colonies into a particular area. One way to visualize this is to consider that, so what we observed after fire is a bunch of flowers with a bunch of bees on there, but are we looking at a few lucky colonies? So in this scenario, we have something like a dozen workers, let's say, but they all flew to that habitat patch from just 2 colonies. Or we could be looking at a scenario where we have a robust population made up of many colonies. And this latter population is going to be more resilient to other perturbations or small population effects. So we can distinguish between these 2 scenarios using genetic mark recapture, which in brief basically means we go out to a landscape, we catch a bunch of individuals, we know their spatial location, and then we take a genetic sample from them, a small toe clip. We extract DNA from that genetic sample and we genotype these individuals. And with that genetic information, we can then assign them to colony groups or sibling groups. And so in this example, we have 7 individuals belonging to 4 different colonies. So the 3 red individuals all flew to these locations from some nest location. And this is similar to individual mark recapture, except instead of redetecting individuals, we're redetecting a colony in the landscape. With these assignments to family, we can then calculate all sorts of interesting things. We can know, for example, that, like I said, we have 7 individuals belonging to 4 colonies, and then we can estimate the number of undetected colonies from that distribution. We can also estimate foraging range crudely as the centroid between our foragers that we detected. So which scenario occurs? Does the post-fire landscape support more colonies, or is it just aggregating them together? When we look at the estimated number of colonies from that mark recapture data, what we find is that before fire, our burn sites were a little bit better than our unburned sites. But after fire, our burn sites support many, many more colonies than our unburned sites. This is once again related to floral abundance. So sites that have more flowers not only have more workers, but those workers belong to more colonies. So a larger population size. We might also want to consider body size here though, because it could be that you have lots of colonies that are able to establish because of the rush of spring resources, but then they're all competing for resources and producing small, cruddy workers that have low survivorship, and the colonies do not reproduce very successfully. So we measured body size in lab with some individuals that we had lethally captured. And what we find is that before fire, there's no substantial difference in body size between the burn categories. And then after fire, there's about a 4% increase in the mean body size of workers. 4% may not sound like a lot, but when we fed this same species unlimited amounts of food in lab colonies, they only grow by about 6%. So to observe a 4% increase in wild caught foragers actually is pretty startling. Because this is California and because invasive grasses do invasive grass things, resources actually were really low 2 growing seasons after the fire. And so both burned and unburned sites had low floral abundance and small body sizes. And once again, this is body size is strongly related to floral abundance. Lastly, we'll consider reproduction. And for this, we're going to look at the number of queens that we observe in spring following fire. And note that when we count the number of queens out in a landscape, it's related back to the resources that were available to them the previous year. So queen abundance and for this, we only have data following fire. We don't have pre-fire queen abundance data. But I can tell you anecdotally from having collected them for rearing experiments, it was about the same as the first season following fire. where we did not observe big differences in the number of queens in burned or unburned sites, suggesting that either queens rapidly reestablish in the burned sites or they're able to survive the fire when they're overwintering underground, since overwintering in this area occurs very early in the year and is somewhat maybe over summering since they go into hibernation so early. And then in the second year following fire, we have a big increase in the amount of queens that we observe. And this is because they had such a great resource year that first year following fire. But interestingly, we don't see a big difference in the number of queens in burned and unburned areas. And our genetic data suggests that this is because queens that were produced under the conditions in the burned areas actually spill over and disperse back into the unburned areas the following year. And so this suggests that fire can have an impact beyond its borders, more or less. So what we found is that there are not only more workers following fire, but there are more colonies, suggesting a larger population size. These colonies aren't resource limited. They produce workers of bigger body sizes, and reproduction is increased after the effects of fire are realized, and that spills over into the unburned area. There are, of course, necessary caveats here, like the effects of fire are, of course, always going to be very context dependent, as we've been discussing, dormant versus growing season fires. For species that have different nesting habits than Bosnicenskii, there might be different challenges or different responses to fire. And we would want to take these, interpret these results carefully if we were considering at-risk species like the rusty patch bumblebee or the western bumblebee, since in this study we can't distinguish between survival or recolonization. And once again, the effects of fire here were very transient because we're talking about grasslands that are heavily invaded. But in something like a conifer forest, the effects of fire could last very long. And here's just an image of all sorts of wonderful grasses coming back into our landscape and ruining our beautiful flowers very quickly. And this slide, I just wanted to share very briefly because I didn't think anyone else was going to bring up the effects of smoke, but it was the very first question asked after Scott's talk. And yeah, if people want to talk more about the impacts of smoke and air quality on insect navigation, the fouling of food, or stigma clogging and the disruption of pollination, I'd be very excited to talk about that. The only relevant study I could find was that a 1980 study suggesting that sulfur dioxide lowered mating behavior in halictid bees. So I think this is an excellent area to consider and study in the future. So with that, I will stop talking at you and start listening to your questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Excellent, John. Thanks so much for that. And I liked your comment about your questionable facial hair there. We all did that when we were young, though, so you don't need to worry about it. We have a number of great questions, and I do think that if you wanted to take a minute to talk a little more about the smoke issue, that was the first question. I wasn't able to answer it in very much detail. So if you wanted to take a minute to just talk about what we know about smoke and at least bees, I think is what you're talking about.
Yeah, so largely it's just a big unexplored topic. So I think if folks were to sit down with a blank piece of paper, you could suddenly find yourself writing tons of interesting questions that don't have very convincing answers. So when I was in California, I had observed, I believe, epilobium flowers, which have really exerted anthers. And they were getting lots of ash on their stigmas. So I suspected that that would cause stigma clogging. Anecdotally, out at the McLaughlin Reserve, when it was smoky, I felt like pollinator activity was way down. Smoke and air quality can change the polarization of light, which might affect insect navigation. So basically, I have nothing conclusive to communicate to anyone other than dang, this is a fascinating topic and we should study it. Yeah.
Great. Somebody wanted to point out, just so because it is moving quickly and you might need to change your slide again, that the California Fish and Game Commission was sued after they moved forward with species status assessment and on the petition bumblebees. And that's being litigated right now. It's in appeal, and so we'll probably understand the outcome of that by mid-2022. So
yeah,
just wanted to
it was a slide I couldn't keep up with, so I stopped bothering to try.
Excellent. So another question is anyone, or are there any research published or in progress specific to rusty patch bumblebee response to fire yet? There wasn't at listing, as far as I'm aware. Some of the first sites it was detected post-listing in Wisconsin are burned more frequently than guidance suggests and have been for decades.
Yeah. All I can think of is pretty tangential things like that. So I know that there's some work coming out of the Claudia Graton's lab looking at other species within sites that rusty patches is found in the effects of fire, specifically on queen counts. Bethan Bruninga Sokolar recently published a paper from Nichusa grasslands that looks at the effects of fire on, I think, bee communities more generally. But Aphanus has been observed at Nichusa. In fact, we collected some genetic samples from Aphanus this past year from Nichusa. So yeah, nothing really quite as strong as one might want, but having driven around the Midwest, and I'm sure lots of folks are listening from sites that they even manage in the Midwest. Maybe I visited your site. It did seem like that the sites that were managed with fire had rusty patch, but so many sites that are managed with fire in the Midwest don't have rusty patch. So I'm not sure that there's anything really satisfying on that topic. Yeah.
Right. One last quick question. You said bumblebees were umbrella species. Would bumblebees, you think, be a good indicator species for the response of other bees to management activities like fire?
This is where I have a lot of issues with the terms like flagship species, umbrella species, indicator species, because they seem to be interpreted differently among different camps and labs and groups. So I'm not really convinced that they can be used as an indicator species, especially because, like we've been talking about, they have long flight distances, long dispersal distances, and while there can be specialization in bumblebee diets, they're typically more generalized than other species. I guess what I meant by that slide and that particular point is that if we feel as if a landscape provides all of the resources needed to support bumblebee populations, then it's likely that lots of those plants are also good food resources for solitary species or species with shorter flight durations. But maybe something like the Cythrus could be good indicator species. And so that's probably an area worth exploring. If you have a very diverse bumblebee community, maybe that is suggesting that the pollinator community broadly is healthy. But if you have something like a lot of impatiens or Grisioculus or Bosnicenskii, these more common species, I don't think that's necessarily a good indication of a robust pollinator community.
Right. Lots more questions we'll get to in final session. So thank you.